Ladies and gentlemen, on this Red Gaming Technicom video, let us discuss further the Xbox One versus PS4 specification difference. This begins because Microsoft recently, in an interview, we'll get to this in just a moment, was quoted in saying the difference between the two consoles is fairly marginal. Now in this video we're going to be discussing some points that are specification based with relevant facts and figures. So if you want to learn more, you can check the article out that I've done about this, and you can see all the different bits of information all laid out in front of you, so you don't have to worry about following along mathematics or numbers so much in the video itself, or indeed links or further information. Anyway, so I'm sure most of you have heard of the argument by now. The PS4 is more powerful than the Xbox One. And honestly, the argument had, for the most part, started to diminish. Resolution gate, of course, was most likely the height of it late last year. Just after / just before the consoles were released, it was really just going absolutely crazy. But Microsoft's Alan Bowman recently was conducting an interview. By the way, that interview link is linked in the article, so if you guys want to read it, you can do so. Anyway, it's a fairly lengthy interview, but the part we're interested in is where he says, "We're optimistic about this generation as well. We've got a unique value proposition, and from a pure spec perspective, it's always going to be a fairly marginal difference. The purists are going to argue the toss. It comes down to the games. We've got great exclusives," and he continues. Once again, I've got that quote and interview linked. So, now, on the face of it, it seems a fairly innocent comment, right? The problem is, of course, immediately the internet started to jump over all over this, and Microsoft were immediately accused of PR. We'll go into this in just a moment, a little bit further in terms of the specifications, but I've always said I think Microsoft, they did a bit of. They struggled along in the test specification war early on, trying to fight a lot of this, and it really didn't work. It actually, in terms of credibility, it actually made them lose a little bit of credibility, I think, in the eyes of many, because once again, people were wondering how did they come up these, where are they getting their information, because it's not really making sense with the specifications that we know about the hardware. Now, I'm not going to read all of the specifications out with you guys that I've compared, because there's quite numerous. If you really want that information, or that in-depth information, you can check the article out. But effectively speaking, the machines of both systems are using exactly the same cores. AMD Jaguar, that's of course 8 cores total. And PS4's CPU is rumored to be running at 1.6. Meanwhile, the Xbox One's 1.75, yet strangely the PS4's CPU, in one benchmark for texture generation at least, the PS4's CPU seems to be faster. I don't know why yet, honestly. There's a few theories that are going around, but they're pretty much a pinch of salt, because it's possible that it's running only on one core. It's possible that it's running on all the cores. We don't know what other factors are really playing into the specification, or rather the benchmark results. But moving on for a moment, both systems have 8 GB of memory. PS4 uses 5500 MHz GDDR5, 256 bus, which gives you 176 GB per second. Xbox One, 2133 MHz DDR3 on a 256-bit bus, providing 68 GB per second, along with the 32 MB of ES RAM. The primary difference is the actual GPU to most people, which is 1.84 teraflops versus 1.32 teraflops of the Xbox One. So a lot of this most likely is coming down to the pure power, the pure ALU / compute performance, as well as most likely fewer texture mapping units and fewer ROBs. Once again, I've got all that information in the article if you really want to know about it. But here's the thing. In theory, this you know, the numbers kind of vary and stuff that you're seeing bandied about. It's about 40 to 50%, depending entirely on what, you know, specifications you're really looking at. But the reality of the matter is, if you were to look at games like, say, Battlefield 4 on the PS4, which is running at 900p, that's 1600 by 900, that's compared to 1280 by 720 on the Xbox One, Call of Duty Ghosts, 1080p on the PS4 versus 720p on the Xbox One, Assassin's Creed on the PS4, 1080p with anti-aliasing on the Xbox One, on the PS4, that's 30 frames per second. But you'll need to patch that to get that. Early versions of AC4 didn't have that, so unless you had the patch, you're going to be playing at like 900p, I think. And 1600 by 900, in other words 900p, 30 frames per second on the Xbox One. Other titles, meanwhile, such as, for example, FIFA and NBA, they have exactly the same resolution on both systems. So, the point being, you know, is it a marginal difference? And this is where it becomes a bit tricky. Because, and in theory, if you were to look at the two specifications on paper, and this is something that, you know, is undeniable, I'm not the one who's created the figures, that, you know, both companies released it. I'm a bit curious why Sony are still yet to deny the PS4's CPU speed. The only thing I can think of, and if so it's pretty weak, if I'm totally honest, is that they just don't want to admit that the PS4 CPU in terms of raw clock speed is slower than the Xbox One. That's the only thing I could think of that they have not released it. I don't really get why they've not. But as I said, in a benchmark it was faster in one test, but that's all we've seen. So I'm trying to get some answers from games developers, but I'm assuming for the most part they're still under NDAs. But regardless, so yeah, for the most part, however, that performance gulf between the PS4's GPU and let's just discuss the GPU for a moment, which is the major primary cause of contention for most people. A lot of that performance just disappears with a small increase in resolution, like 900p to 1080p. Now, don't get me wrong, it's a substantial difference in pixel resolution. It's basically 1.44 million versus just over 2 million. Once again, I've got those maths and how I derived those numbers in the article. But here's the thing. How much are you going to notice? That really depends on the screen you're playing on, the distance you are, your own eyesight, and other factors as well. In other words, if you're playing on, like, just for example, a 24-inch HD TV and you're reasonable distance from it, you probably, for the most part, most people aren't going to notice that difference. On the other hand, if you're playing on like a 40-inch or like a 50-inch HD TV, really high quality, and you're reasonably close to it, you're probably going to see that difference much more easily. And there could also be other factors as well, maybe slightly lower resolution lighting on the Xbox One, maybe improved anti-aliasing for the PS4, but for right now I think that cross-platform games for the foreseeable future, they won't really have huge differences. Long term, it's possible that we're going to be seeing more differences creep in, but here's the real thing. It's always the exclusive games that look the best. It's always the exclusive games which push the systems to their absolute darn limits. And I think it's far too early to call that yet. I think it's fairly obvious that the PS4's specs are superior. But in my opinion, it's not a big deal for Microsoft. I think they should just say, you know what? Whatever. Here are the games we've got. And I think the PS4's games are great. Don't get me wrong, I own a PS4. But I also think the Xbox One's games are looking really good, and they've got a good solid lineup. And let's be honest. If you have a system that is, let's just say for example the PS4, let's just be silly for a moment. Let's just say the PS4 was 3 or 4 times more powerful than it is. Right, so let's even say that it has a 6 T-flop GPU. Let's just be completely silly. So that would be like a really high-end PC GPU inside it. But let's just say the games were absolutely ludicrously terrible. Say it had the worst console lineup ever. Let's just say that in this magical fantasy land that we're creating, that there were no games like Infamous Second Son on the horizon, that it was just a travesty of a launch. Would anyone really buy it? Sure, they probably would. They'd, get suckered in by the visuals, but long term, a console wouldn't do well. So, graphics aren't everything. I think the Xbox One is powerful enough to do what it needs, but I think Microsoft, the specification war, unless there's something we really don't know about the Xbox One, and there's no hidden GPU, Microsoft have confirmed this. So, the reality of the matter is they've lost the specification war, but the most important war that they can definitely still win is what they can bring to the table in terms of the games, and there you have it. Anyway, I'm going to get going. Hopefully you've enjoyed the video, and it's just amazing how quickly things like this blow up on the forums and the usual places this stuff starts to appear. I think it's definitely like this on the Xbox 360 and PS3. Maybe not quite so prolific, but it was certainly around, and I think every generation of systems it seems to become worse. Maybe it's because the internet's becoming that much more vocal. It's hard to tell. Anyway, I'm going to get going. Hopefully you've enjoyed the video, my friend. I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.